Right, class, for this week, we are looking at Mexico. So, in this lecture, we're just going to give a little background on Mexico and the Spanish involvement, and then talk a little bit about struggles of Mexican Americans. So, even long before Hernan Cortez led a band of less than 1,000 men to conquest Mexico and the rest of Central America and Southwest America, there were people that lived in those areas. We, of course, collectively call them Indians, Native Americans, Latin Americans, Alaskan Americans, Pacific Islanders. But all in all, these groups of people, even though collectively they're all Indians, they all have their own unique culture and they're not the same type of groups of people, right? So just like when we look at Europeans and we note that we're not the same groups of people, right, guys? We've got Mexicans and not Mexicans, excuse me. I was reading my slide. We have Spanish and French and German and Czechoslovakian and Russian, and all those different cultures collectively make up Europe. So, as Cortez and the rest of his Spanish conquistadors and those that followed him, they were pretty brutal and bloody to the people that lived here, and the ones that escaped death were converted to Christianity. That was a strong motive of the Spanish conquering America. And then most of the indigenous people were forced into some type of slave labor that revolved around agriculture, so some kind of a staple crop production. And so in Mexico and Peru, the Spanish, that labor system, they called that, I'll probably mess this up, in Comida or something to that effect. Basically, what they did was they modeled Aztec and the Inca labor method. So they found that even though they were being brutal to the people, they figured out that by modeling what the Aztec and Inca were already doing, it was a little easier to get cooperation from people. And then, of course, along with agriculture, silver was really Spain's economic and political backbone in the 16th century. So by the mid 1500s, Spain's global empire, pretty much it reached its zenith. And so, Spain was really starting to crumble by the close of the 16th century. And historians have often suggested that when it comes to those various patterns of conquest, submission, and resistance, we see following Columbus's voyages that, we have a lot of conflicting explanations. And just what that means is we have, a lot of different versions of kind of what was going on. And I think that's just a normal part of being human. We all kind of, it's kind of a confirmation bias. It's kind of a perception thing. And so, we tend to all story. And then within that, we all have our collective stories too. So by the time we get to the 16th, 17th century, Mexico, most of South America or Latin America had gained its independence from the Spanish and the Portuguese. And even at this time, the Dutch and the French, well, maybe not the Dutch as much, but the French most definitely had a lot of slave colonies down in Latin America and in the Caribbean islands, and sugar was the main staple crop. Of course, sugar, coffee, and then they don't really talk about it, but cocaine has always kind of been a big crop that has come from Latin America too. And before that was an illegal substance, it was actually a hot staple item that was in everything, guys, that you can think of. And that is how the soda, Coca-Cola, famously got started. It was indeed called Coca-Cola because it did have cocaine in it. So basically, cocaine is this, it's a natural plant and it kind of grows. I don't know if you guys have ever seen like sugar cane or maybe even like bamboo. They kind of grow on these stalks and these leaves that come off. And so um, the people in the area there, they would eat, those cocaine leaves, and it would give them a little adrenaline rush. So that was something that they used during slave times. They would let the slaves have cocaine because they figured out that it made them more productive. So fun little fact. They went over to Africa, and since marijuana, I guess, was a bigger natural plant growing on that continent, they decided since the cocaine plants were helping the slaves over here in Americas, that marijuana would help the slaves over in Africa, and then instead it typically, made them made them unproductive and actually a little less cooperative. So they pretty much nipped the colonial powers nipped that in the bud. But yeah, that's just a little fun fact there. So by the time we see Mexico starting to gain her independence from the Spanish, we see Diaz is erected, and this is really one of the first dictatorships. Sadly, since the end of colonialism, and most of Latin America, well, all of Latin America, excuse me, gained its independence. They've had a lot of trouble with poverty, drugs, gang violence, and then dictatorships, and that was a huge problem during the Cold War, because both the United States and the Soviet Union were really using these newly formed nation states in Latin America to pretty much just like wreak havoc on each other. And I mean, it would be like Russia or the Soviet Union would support like this president coming into power. Well, it would end up being a dictatorship where they would like murder half the population. So then there would be a coup. The United States would back the next dictator that came in, and then we see the same thing. They ended up being this horrible evil person that killed off everybody else, and so they just kept they those superpowers really used Latin American countries as banna fodder, pretty much. They were just little chess pieces during the Cold War. So that really explains a lot of why we still, see this violence and, these drug trafficking and human trafficking that goes on to our south with our sister continent there of South America. And, that explains it's a pretty big political issue at times too, because of immigration and illegal immigration. And then, of course, in the past decade, we've always had an issue of, wanting to build a wall, and we've kind of got a big part of a wall. So, we definitely, Latin America, Mexico, and America definitely are not without its problems, and have an interesting history there. So by the time Diaz gets into his dictatorship in 1876, we see acquisition of 90% of the indigenous people's land. So pretty much what that means is he just took the land away from them, and mismanaged economy that led to a lot of food being imported from the United States. And then there was stuff being exported from Mexico. And then of course when NAFTA was formed in the oh gosh, from the 80s, 90s there, a lot of people criticized NAFTA and saying that it was only really beneficial to the United States and Mexico, because those two, because of our proximity, we have a very close import and export commerce between the two countries, right? So what we start to see is, there's a dictatorship going on. There is classism going on. At this point, there's unequal rights, or a lot of human right violations, civil right violations going on throughout Mexico. And so the elite, they were really afraid of there being an uprising of some kind, some kind Revolution. And so that leads us to the Mexican Revolution. And, this was a really influential revolution because it really changed the course of Latin America and, just the way they were going economically, politically, socially, and just how Latin America started to really, gain ground as far as being a part of the global system, right? All right, so pretty much we see the Mexican American Revolution. It was very violent, it was very prolonged, and it was basically it was a contest of powers between different caudillos, and those are just kind of like groups of ruling class, basically. And basically by the time we get to Texas and Santa Ana and the whole Alamo affair, we see half of Mexico is lost to the United States. And this really crippled, that in itself really crippled Mexico's prospect for a balanced government. Then we have the Law of Reforma, and this revolutionary movement overthrew Santa Ana. And then we see Benito Juarez. He fought a 3-year civil war against conservative forces. And despite these early efforts at reform, Juarez it ruled in dictatorship. And then we see that Diaz, of course, he ruled until 1911. And this is when we had I'll probably butcher this word, uh, Porfiriato, a period of political repression and rapid economic development. And so, pretty much during the Mexican revolution, we see these different leaders coming in. And once again, there's a lot of dictatorship, a lot of violence going on. And then, there's a lot of foreign intervention from the United States, because by the beginning of the 20th century, America was starting to get big into imperialism. They felt they didn't need to be involved in any of Europe's affairs or the rest of the world. And so they were really trying to dominate this part of the world and, really looking to the Caribbean islands and Latin America as profitable economic gains. And so when we get to the Mexican American War, it really starts off with that borderlands there of New Mexico and Texas, where they, of course, connect with Mexico. And so it's kind of ironic, guys, because we have to remember at this time in history, pretty much the whole southwestern part of the United States was still Mexico. And so rather than what we have now, Mexicans trying to get into America, at this time we had Americans and these early settlers were all trying to get to that Mexico territory, right? And so because America and South America too was still under a slave system, gaining more land and territory was a big deal for the United States because of slavery. It gotten to a point of we hadn't had the Civil War just yet. This is kind of on the verge of the Civil War. So slavery really was a big issue. It was like, do we allow new states? And if we do allow new states, do we allow them to have slaves? And when it came to Texas, Texas was pretty much like that was like the playing field of where it all enacted itself out. And so because of tension growing in Texas, the Americans there, they found themselves at odds with the Mexican government. There were Americans settling in undisputed territory, so pretty much like they didn't have the right to be in those areas. Hang on, I've lost my. And then, of course, when it came to how they Hispanic cultures and Native American cultures, they didn't consider them American or part of the American community. And then, of course, we have the black slaves that weren't not considered Americans and a part of the economy too. And so, with all these different cultures coming together, there's kind of a frontier of accommodation, but at the same time, there's a lot of conflict, which is pretty normal when you see a bunch of different groups of people getting together. There's always going to be some kind of conflict stage that has to be worked out. I'd say, though, that when it comes to the past, people were definitely more violent than needed to be, right? So by the time we get to February, March of 1836, this is when we see 187 Texans fortifying the Alamo and standing out. They were standing up against Mexican President Santa Anna, and there were 5,000 Mexican troops, and of course, everybody at the Alamo was killed. However, we know that the way that played out then is that Texas was became a part of the United States. So, I think I had my slides out of there. So once again, let's go back to this idea of slavery. So when Mexico gained its independence in 1821, there were many small farmers, common laborers. There were a lot of threats from the Comanche Indians that lived in Texas, and they really just followed the buffalo. They didn't have any interest in Christian conversion. They didn't really want to be incorporated into this new society, and so they had many relentless raids on the Texas settlement. And then once again, Texas was different from the rest of America's settlements and frontiers because Texas settlement was fully legal. Land ownership was permitted through formal contracts with the Mexican government. And then, once again, this idea of trying to expand America's territory so that they could pretty much have more areas to cultivate cotton and more slaves. But by the time we get to about 1835, the Mexico government has restricted the number of American immigrants that are allowed to come into the territories. Like I said, ironic. That's kind of a flip of the pages there. If we look at some of the modern issues with immigration, and the Mexican government also outlawed slavery in the area, but ultimately the Mexican government, they didn't recognize a Texas independence. So then that's when we get to the Mexican American War, and that was originally called Mr. Polk's War. And basically, it was called Mr. Polk's War because Mr. Polk used the war as an opportunity to expand and redefine the role of the president as commander in chief during times of war. So yes, Polk, that was the president at the time, President Polk. And what we see is just within a few months of very brutal fighting, Mexico City fell to American forces. That pretty much ended the war. And then we have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that was signed in 1848. And that is when Mexico ceded northern province of California, New Mexico, and accepted the Rio Grande as the boundary of Texas. And so they pretty much that's what they gave to America. And then the United States, we paid Mexico $15 million in return for the land. We actually gave them $15 million for it. So there of course were border concerns over expansion, southern doubts about just, black people, Indians, everybody mixing breeds, God forbid, right? And how that wouldn't just, the same kind of fear we see in the South up to segregation and that we still see in many areas of the South, this fear of just things being different and, just kind of being different, I guess, in general. So President Polk accepted the treaty. Congress later paid Mexico $10 million for the Gaston Purchase to facilitate a southern Railroad. And the Mexican American War was the first war to be extensively covered by the news media and presented to the American public on a nearly daily basis. And this is also when we see the beginning of what is called yellow journalism. So think of like fake news would be a good way to put it. Yeah, I don't know if any of you guys are old enough. They used to be like these um papers called like the Natural Enquirer or the Sun, the Star, and it would be these stories of woman has bat boy baby, and aliens abducted some John Travolta, or like just kind of like wild and crazy stories like that. And then a lot of it is just propaganda. So when you see like political satire cartoons, those are a kind of a version of yellow journalism too. It's all about portraying a certain view, a certain opinion to sway the public. And of course, the war in Mexico was criticized by many of the Whig Party. They just believed that it was unnecessary. It just looked like it was this land grab, especially for the slave owners. And then, of course, like I said, what do we see in about another couple of decades? The issue of expanding slavery in slave states, because it becomes one of the primary causes of the Civil War. All right, so then we fast forward to modern times, and that brings us up into the 20th century. And there are many civil rights issues that face Latin Americans in the United States, things like low pay for really physically demanding jobs, housing, employment, education discrimination, discrimination by law enforcement. And then, of course, there are the issues of immigration and just migration and legal immigration and illegal immigration. And I know our media and politics like to focus a lot on the illegal aspects of immigration. But there are a lot of people that migrate over here and are here in the United States legally. And so it's very biased and prejudiced just to see somebody and think they're Mexican American and then automatically they're legal, they're deplorable, they're a bad person. That's not true. There are good and bad people in all groups of people. We can't just pick and choose whom we want to be bad at the moment, if you guys know what I mean. So when it comes to Mexican Americans in the United States, they are the largest Latino subgroup. There are approximately 3/4 of all Latinos in the United States. Of course, they tend to live more in the Southwest. Puerto Ricans are the second largest subgroup, and Puerto Ricans are actually not a part of Latino culture. They're just very similar because of proximity, but we really don't include them when we talk about Latin America. Puerto Rico is separate, and it's over with the Caribbean islands, which are also their own specific type of cultural group. And then, of course, Puerto Rico is actually a commonwealth of the United States. So it's kind of like they're kind of like a state, but they're their own country. So, we recognize them as being independent, yet Puerto Ricans are considered part of America and are given American citizenship at birth, and they're allowed to travel back and forth unrestricted. And then last, we have Cuban Americans who make up the third largest subgroups. And of course, a lot of them came during the time of Fidel Castro when he had a lot of political refugees that migrated to America, and especially Florida and New York. Oh no, wait, sorry, one especially in Florida. Sorry, Puerto Ricans. You find a lot of that group in New York. And despite their differences, Latin Americans tend to identify more with the Democratic Party, except for Cubans, because they're very anti-communist and they have more of a Republican voting trend. Overall, though, Latinos tend to be more conservative, on social issues and more liberal on economic issues. So, all right, guys, that just wraps up a brief little overview of Mexico and the Mexican culture. So, make sure you get in your discussions this week. Make sure you're including those APA elements for all of your assignments and reach out for anything, guys. I'm here for you. Keep striving for excellence, and I will EC you in our discussions. Thanks, guys. Bye. Leave the chickens alone. Crazy dogs. Did he try to get her? Did the dogs try to get the chicken? Hey, you know.